Hey everybody, welcome back. Another video for you. Thank you as always for all of the support. Go over to Patreon, patreon.com/Eric Draitzer to find all of the videos there, both the ones that are freely available to everybody and the ones that are just for subscribers. You can also subscribe on YouTube. And of course, I will, as always, try to plug Counterpunch and Counterpunch Plus. Counterpunch Radio is the podcast. You can listen to all episodes are free and available to everybody. Counterpunch Plus is the subscriber section. I highly recommend that very affordable subscription to the best publication on the left, in my humble opinion. Okay, let me move over to a lot of stories that are coming out of Russia. Obviously, there's so much to talk about. There's no way that I'm going to be able to fit it all into a short video here. So I'm going to focus exclusively today on the impact of Russia's, Putin's so-called partial mobilization of Russian conscripts to fight in Ukraine. This is, of course, the news of the last week or so. I'm obviously not the only one talking about it. I'm sure I'm not the only one who you're listening to talking about it. But if I could, I would like to try to give a big picture of what's happening and how we should be thinking about all of the different dimensions of Russian society, Russian civil society, Russian political culture, and how that relates to what we're actually seeing in these videos on Twitter and Telegram and elsewhere. It can be somewhat overwhelming to scroll through a dozen or 2 dozen different Telegram feeds and just see hundreds of such videos, and without really having the broad context of what it is that you're looking at, you might have a false sense of what's happening. So anyway, I'm going to run through a number of different stories. This is not one of my quote unquote freestyling videos where I'm not referring to anything and I'm just kind of speaking. I do have a number of stories that I will reference here. I will also include links in the video or at the bottom of the video in the notes or wherever if you're interested in finding the actual articles. I'm, of course, referencing all reputable news outlets, none of the Putin cheerleading propaganda, none of the NATO cheerleading propaganda. This is just reality. All right. Putin's mobilization, first and foremost, I would argue, is an extremely overt sign of weakness. I think Putin understands this. I don't think that Putin entered into this decision lightly. I think he recognizes the potential ramifications for himself and for all of Russian society. This is a major escalation and a major risk that Putin is taking because, again, just as a general understanding, Russian society has, for the most part, more or less continued on unchanged. Obviously, economics have changed. People's living standards are declining. People's wealth is deteriorating, etc. Excuse me. But all of those things, I think, can be more or less swept under the rug, as it were. That is to say, society continues to go on. People continue to go to work and things move on more or less normally. But this is no longer normal, because prior to this, you had a sort of passive population that was mostly unaffected. Now you're broadening the scope of the kinds of people who are going to be affected, and that will, of course, have knock-on effects on the social stability, the social fabric, etc. So, without, I don't want to just focus in generalities. Let's get into some specifics. I would say that, and I'm oversimplifying, of course. There's many nuances that have to be added, but I would say that resistance to Putin's efforts or resistance to this mobilization really comes from more or less three distinct categories of Russians. I would say, and I mean, there's more, obviously, more than three, but three general. One would be sort of, let's call it the anti war category, right? This would be those that we would consider traditional anti-war voices, left-wingers, socialists, anarchists, activists of various kinds, liberals, liberal Democrats, the liberal opposition, the various anti-Putin elements in Moscow and St. Petersburg primarily, though not exclusively, the major cities basically. This would all be kind of the one category, I would say, of anti-war sort of voices. And these are the voices that we saw mostly in the beginning of the war, when we saw in the very early days an eruption of some anti-war protests in Moscow and St. Petersburg in particular. That was mostly from this category. Another category that we should be thinking about is what you might call the marginalized elements of Russian society, those that live outside of the major cities, that live in some of these distant Russian republics, many of which are at the lowest levels of the Russian Federation's economic ladder, as it were. You have a tremendous amount of poverty and economic despair in a lot of these areas, and I'm talking about places like Buryatia, Dagestan, Ingushetia, Tuva, other regions in the Russian Federation that have, to a large extent, provided a lot of the cannon fodder that has been, that has been killed during this 7 months of war. These areas, and I'm going to go in detail into a few of them, these areas are also very much beginning to see at least the early signs of some unrest. Now, I don't want to overstate the kind of unrest that's happening. We don't see, a general strike in Russia. We don't see society coming to a grinding halt. Things are continuing on. But the signs of resistance to this, they're unmistakable, they're overt, and they're happening all over the place. So we have to pay attention to those. And then I would say the third category that really is problematic for Putin in this regard is, I would say, the threat from his right, the ultranationalist threat. They're not opposed to the mobilization, but they are opposed to the way that that Putin and his people have been prosecuting this war. So they represent a different kind of resistance to Putin's mobilization and so forth. And I'm going to talk about them in a minute. So there's a number of stories that I'm going to touch on, and they all kind of relate to this same theme. So I guess the overarching point that I want to make is how we should understand what's happening in Russia broadly. How do we place it into a context for understanding Russian society by collecting a lot of these little snippets of information from different parts of the country? Because again, if you're just following Moscow or St. Petersburg, you're missing a lot of what's happening in the country. So we have a story from, I believe this was the Moscow Times: Tatarstan bans reservists from leaving while mobilization is underway. So now you have another one of these republics. And here's the quote right out of the official transmission from the Russian government: officers, warrant officers, midshipmen, sergeants, foremen, soldiers, and sailors of the reserve are temporarily prohibited from traveling outside the district. Now, listen to what is actually in the provisions here. It is not only saying that they're banned from leaving, it also requires business owners to ensure that every one of their employees who is registered in the reserves of the military must show up at the enlistment offices, or the company will be fined. So you can see some of the ways in which the Russian government is using different levers of control to force this mobilization through despite its unpopularity. It's not just government officials coming to your door and blackbagging your husband and kidnapping him in the night. No, it's things like very, professional sounding memos sent to your boss reminding him of the administrative penalties and fees that will be assessed on him and his company if he refuses to ensure that his employees are showing up to the enlistment office. So naturally, all of these middle managers and owners of businesses and so forth, who are themselves likely not going to get conscripted, they're going to make sure that their frontline workers do get conscripted. So on the one hand, this is a recipe for conflict, between the poorest elements of society and, their bosses in their workplaces and so forth. But it is also potentially setting the stage for conflicts with local government officials, with business owners and business leaders versus local government officials. So on the one hand, it shows how Putin has various levers of power to essentially manufacture new soldiers. And on the other hand, it also shows the significant drawbacks of this approach and the potential ways in which it could backfire on the Kremlin. So Tatarstan is a good example of one of the regions that has just straight out outlawed freedom of movement. Freedom of movement no longer exists in Tatarstan. Okay, moving on. Here's another story. This one comes from the Barents Observer. Headline: Russian miners and oilmen go to war. Very interesting. So, on the one hand, we have local government officials saying, to business owners, you have to make sure that your employees show up. On the other hand, you have the federal government directly out of the energy ministry sending a letter to the country's energy, mining, and iron ore processing companies requesting compliance with Putin's partial mobilization order. Now, think about what this actually means. Well, let me read it. This is the letter from Deputy Energy Minister Sorokin, who writes, quote, "The majority of workers in our industry meet the requested military requirements and also have experience from conscription in armed forces of the USSR and of Russia." Very interesting to imagine what it would take for somebody to have military experience in the USSR. That would make this person uh, 50 at the youngest, I would imagine. So anyway, I'm looks like there's some kind of lag in the video. I don't know why that's happening. Okay, moving on. So the energy ministry says that they will be working closely, whatever that means, closely with companies to make sure that each and every individual male employee registers at the enlistment offices. And it says that all men in the industry will be given a day off to register at their local enlistment office. So, very interesting. They're pulling directly out of the energy sector, they're pulling workers and sending them to Ukraine. One can already see the problems that will emerge from this strategy as you lose qualified workers and operators and all of the different people that make that critical industry run efficiently and effectively. Many of them are now either going to go into hiding, try to flee the country, or simply go and serve in Russia's military and potentially die in some ditch somewhere outside of some Ukrainian town. Okay, so very dangerous development, especially if you consider just how reliant Russia is on the energy sector. Moving on, and I'm moving somewhat quickly because I understand that when we go past 20 minutes, it becomes a little bit much for some people. So I'm skipping over a lot. You'll have to just bear with me. Another interesting development: Chechnya, which has played such an outsized role, both in terms of numbers, but also in terms of social media presence, such an outsized role in this war. Chechnya and its, dictator, Ramzan Kadyrov, Chechnya has exempted itself from Russia's draft. Very interesting development. You think Putin is a totalitarian dictator who can simply not abide any sort of resistance from his underlings, and yet you have somebody like Kadyrov, who himself is a brutal thug, who also does have, at least to some degree, this leeway to be critical of the Kremlin, to attack the Kremlin from its right, and to openly defy the orders of Putin. So this is again one of those areas where Russia's government and sort of the political balance of forces doesn't fit neatly under one clear label that people in the West like to use: totalitarian, authoritarian, whatever it might be. It is those things to some degree, but there's also internal dynamics whereby somebody like Kadyrov can openly simply refuse to follow the diktats of Putin. Now, whether that holds true in the weeks and months to come, we shall see. But Kadyrov says that Chechnya has already already fulfilled its conscription quota. According to his statement, Chechnya has provided 254% of its required quota. In other words, way beyond what Chechnya was supposed to provide in terms of its population. Now, that's the number that Kadyrov has provided. I don't know if that's the verified number or not, but who cares? That's what he's saying. He had to face open protests from a number of Chechen mothers. And the Chechen mothers who had come out to protest on the streets, he had to address them and basically say, we hear you, we see you, you are the greatest, the mothers of our soldiers are the greatest in the world, etc., etc. Please be calm, please be patient, please go home, that sort of thing. Now, on the one hand, Kadyrov is kind of quelling a little bit of domestic resistance. Maybe resistance is overstating it, but he's attempting to tamp down some dissent. On the other hand, he's also openly attacking, more or less, the Kremlin for their decision on this recent prisoner exchange. Now, just backing up, in case you haven't followed the most recent developments, the prisoner exchange I'm talking about refers to the 200 some prisoners that the Ukrainians received back. Those were the defenders of the Azovstal steelworks, those who had been ultimately captured by the Russians after several the several weeks of holding out, and this was a few months ago. Anyway, those prisoners are being returned to Ukraine in exchange for something like 55 Russian POWs and one Viktor Medvedchuk, who is the Ukrainian politician who was seen as Putin's proxy and who is basically more or less accused of treason in Ukraine. So anyway, this prisoner exchange really pissed off Kadyrov because Kadyrov, of course, sent his elite Chechen soldiers, A, to hunt Zelensky, but B, supposedly, to hunt Nazis, the Nazis of the Azov Battalion. And it is the so-called Nazis of the Azov Battalion that are being handed back to Ukraine. Now, I should clarify, when I say the Nazis of the Azov Battalion, I'm using Russia's language and how they describe the Azov Battalion, which anybody who actually understands what it is knows is this bizarre sort of combination of old, unreconstructed neo-Nazis combined with newer recruits since Azov became part of the military in this sort of paramilitary capacity up until 2022. So anyway, that whole history has created a very, I would say, more complicated picture of what Azov is. And obviously, the public scrutiny of Azov has forced Ukraine to distance itself from Azov as a Nazi detachment to Azov as a sort of combined fighting force that ultimately, and this is the part that is clearly and unmistakably true, ultimately has won the affection of Ukrainians because of the resistance to the Russians. You see, this is where the self-fulfilling prophecy comes in. The Russians say the Azov Battalion are a bunch of Nazis who need to be eliminated, and by virtue of attempting to eliminate the Azov Battalion, forces the Azov Battalion to be the defenders of Azovstal and of Mariupol, and thereby creates the heroic Azov Battalion that the Russians manufactured in the first place. So it's a weird sort of cycle. And the only reason I even bring it up, honestly, is because of the way that these really ridiculous leftists in the United States and elsewhere try to use Azov Battalion as a cudgel to sort of justify this clear war crime, clear crime against humanity, as if a detachment of 1,000 people, even if they were all hardened Nazis, would somehow justify this kind of criminal and wantonly sort of genocidal kind of behavior from the Russians. Anyway, Kadyrov is pissed because not only did the Chechens fail to get Zelensky, which is part of what he had wanted because of his hatred for Zelensky, but also because these Azov Battalion fighters, who are now clearly seen as heroes, not only by Ukraine, but by much of the world, they're now handed right back to Ukraine. So Kadyrov is upset about this. He doesn't seem to think that Medvedchuk and Russian POWs are worth the exchange. He's maybe has a point from the perspective of a Russian ultranationalist. But in any event, he Kadyrov is voicing the sentiments of nationalists in Russia, ultra nationalists, who are on the right of Putin here, who basically are saying that the mistake that Putin and the Kremlin have made is not fighting the war hard enough, not going all the way, not fully committing. So, in essence, Kadyrov is attacking Putin from the right, saying more or less that Putin is weak. And this is, I think, a very real message that is landing on the right in Russia. And it's certainly something that Putin has to worry about. Okay, moving on. Very interesting video from Zelensky himself. You know, Zelensky does these daily videos. This is something that he has really mastered and turned into almost an art form, the way that he is able to garner public opinion and public sentiment in the West, and also, of course, in Ukraine, through these videos and this sort of daily social media like contact that he has with people. Well, he has taken this opportunity, this moment, to speak directly to the Russian people, which is not something he normally does in these videos. And again, just to back up, to bring in the linguistic issue, remember that part of the issue with Zelensky when he came in was that Zelensky was more or less a Russian Ukrainian. In other words, he spoke Russian, not Ukrainian. Russian was his primary language, not Ukrainian. He spent time in Russia. He did business in Russia. He, et cetera. So this was somebody who was not, seen as Ukrainian enough, especially by Ukraine's nationalists on the right. And so Zelensky had to make significant efforts at convincing Ukraine that he was Ukrainian enough, speaking in Ukrainian, doing all of this, sort of Ukrainian nationalist fig leaves, offering good, what am I trying to say? What am I trying to say? Placating the nationalist right in order to justify his own political position. Here's a Russian speaking Jew trying to govern a country where vast portions of the country have attempted to dissociate themselves from Russia, from the Russian language, and also deeply held anti-Semitic views that still run very deep among the right, both in Russia and Ukraine. Anyway, Zelensky has mastered this sort of art form of using these videos, and he's now turned one directly at the Russians. And I think this is a very interesting thing that needs to be highlighted. So Zelensky spoke to Russians about the mobilization. He spoke in the Russian language, of course, and I think that we should not. I think we should not underestimate the emotional impact. And I'm going to read just a bit of his statement, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about it. Okay. He says, and this is really just a small portion of it, quote, Russia's decision for mobilization is an admission that their professional army, trained for decades to capture what belongs to others, did not withstand and crumbled. Because of mobilization, for most Russian citizens, Russia's war against Ukraine is no longer just something on TV or online, but something that has come to every Russian home. 55,000 Russian soldiers have died in this war within half a year. Tens of thousands wounded, disabled. Do you really want more? You don't? Then protest, struggle, flee, or surrender to Ukraine. These are your options for survival. Now, I'm not going to read the rest of his rather lengthy sort of speech, but I think that it's important to note the emotional impact that something like this is going to have. Remember, it is not just what he's saying; it is who is saying it. Remember the propaganda in Russia and the Kremlin's propaganda, which has said at various times, here's a Jewish Nazi, here's a cokehead, here's an actor, an idiot, a comedian, a globalist, a demon, a Jewish rat, all of the different things that you get, depending on whether you're reading, Russian fascists from the Orthodox Church or Russian ultranationalists or what have you, right? Zelensky represents everything that is evil about Ukraine, everything that is demonic about the West, and on and on and on. And then here's this guy who comes on video, maybe for the first time being seen by a lot of Russians who, for most of this war, have been able to ignore it, not pay attention. As Boris Kagarlitsky noted on my Counterpunch radio show, he said, 85% of the country is apolitical, doesn't even pay attention to what's happening politically, both in the country and around the world. So for many Russians, this might actually be maybe the first time that they're tuning in with any interest at all into the Telegram video or wherever they're finding it of Zelensky's speech. And here they see this photogenic, articulate Russian speaker who is able to say what is plainly the truth about the number of people killed, etc. Okay, I think that we should not underestimate how this might land. And I know that the Ukrainians aren't. It's why Zelensky makes these videos. It's why he made this one. That this is how you sort of insert yourself and break apart morale inside of Russia. Force Russian conversations to turn on this guy Zelensky and on what they've been told about him versus what they see now 7 months later. Even if just a fraction of the people that see the video begin to question what they've been told about Zelensky, perhaps they're also beginning to question what they're told about the war or the special military operation. This is the idea behind what Zelensky is doing. I think it is effective, and I think that he will probably continue doing something like this, especially given how far Putin is pushing it with regard to this mobilization. All right, moving on. I'm behind time, 25 minutes already. So let me go on to a couple of these regions that I've been talking about, these regions that for various reasons have disproportionately been impacted by this war. I already mentioned a couple of them. So there's a little bit of reporting from Buryatia. Buryatia is this region near Lake Baikal. If you look at your map in Siberia, this is a relatively isolated region. There is there's not really any way to explain it other than to say this is an extremely poor part of the country that is to a large extent geographically isolated. I'm going to get into the other one that's even more geographically isolated in a second. Anyway, Buryatia is losing soldiers at a higher rate than almost any other region of the Russian Federation. Buryatia is made up of 30% ethnic Buryats, so it's roughly 70%, give or take 66 to 70% ethnic Russian speakers, Russian people who have moved into that territory in the last 150 years. It's actually more recent than that, really. But anyway, I'm not going to get into that history. They are, to a large extent, well below most of the society. Most of the population is well below Russia's median income, median salary. Median salary. And that is a great indicator of military losses. The lower a region is on the Russian Federation's income scale, median income scale, the higher their losses in this war. This is, and Russia is certainly not alone in that. We can probably map something very similar in the United States, where poverty is also one of the great drivers of military recruitment. So I think we understand that this is how imperial armies work. Imperial armies are going to prey on the poor, on the weak, on the marginalized, the disenfranchised, etc. This is true in the United States. It's true in Russia. It was true in Rome, 2,000 years ago. So anyway, so reporting from a good local news source called the People of Baikal. So in the capital of Buryatia, Ulan-Ude, there's not a lot of unrest against the mobilization. So this is interesting because what's happening is the men that are going to these recruitment centers and to enlist and so forth, these are the men who are not resisting, right? They're willingly going. To a large extent, some of them see this, probably most of them really see this as purely contract work. They're going to make more money going to Ukraine to fight for Russia than they ever would sitting at home and working whatever menial jobs they might be able to find. In other words, this is the way out of poverty. This is why the numbers are as staggering as they are. And this is what Russia counts on. Of course, I'm going to get into more of that in a second. They count on this in order to insulate, the affluent parts of Russian society from the actual effects of the war, which is why the mobilization is so problematic, because this now brings the war out of places like Buryatia and Tuva and Dagestan and Abkhazia and all of these other, not Abkhazia, Caucasia and all of these other regions and brings them to Moscow and St. Petersburg and Yekaterinburg and these other major cities. You see in the report from people of Baikal, you have middle-aged conscripts arriving on buses, 45 years old, 49 years old, coming to get their guns and get in a tank and go fight in Ukraine. I think again this should illustrate how dire the situation is becoming for the Russian military. Quote, everyone knew mobilization was coming and was internally prepared for authorities to come for them. End quote. That's a quote from one anonymous official in Buryatia. In other words, the people of Buryatia knew way before Putin ever made this announcement that a full mobilization was coming for them, and it has. Similarly, in a neighboring region, just west of Lake Baikal, which borders the northern Russia's southern border or the northern border of Mongolia, so it's right up against Mongolia, is the region known as Tuva. Tuva is also extremely geographically isolated, even more so than Buryatia. It has no train connections. It has, I believe, one road and one small airport. This region leads all other regions in per capita military deaths in Ukraine. And unlike Buryatia and some of these other regions, Tuva is actually only has a minority of Russians, 16% of the total population. In other words, the vast majority of the population are ethnic Tuvans. Okay, so this is very, very important to understand. This first of all, this is the region that Defense Minister Shoigu comes from. So Shoigu, in some ways, in this region, is almost he's not equal to Putin, but he's almost equal to Putin. They see Putin, and this was part of the propaganda that the United Russia Party used in this region years ago, that Putin was essentially the reincarnation of Genghis Khan, and that Shoigu is essentially, his right hand man, his almost his equal. Anyway, the highest Tuva, unlike as I said, unlike Buryatia, Tuva is not majority Russian. It has the highest levels of poverty in all of Russia, in all of the Russian Federation. 34% of the population lives in poverty, 7% in extreme poverty, which, I mean, that dwarfs the poverty levels for Russia as a whole. So it is in the extreme as far as poor regions of the country. It is second to last behind Ingushetia in per capita income. It has 3 times as many Tuvans being killed as Dagestanis being killed in Ukraine. And Dagestan is one of those Caucasus regions that I've also done a video on, talking about the inordinate number of military deaths that come from that region. So Tuva is actually exceeds Dagestan by threefold. So, I mean, that tells you just how bad it is. Shoigu comes from Tuva. His face adorns buildings there. And anyway, again, another region in Russia that is now going to bear even more of the brunt of this mobilization, where, again, Putin calls it a partial mobilization, where a lot of people in places like Buryatia and Tuva know there's nothing partial about it. All right, almost finished here. Just a couple of more stories that are worth looking at. Russia threatens to denaturalize draft-defying Central Asians. Very interesting. 2 stories combined here that need to be looked at. On the one hand, Russia says that any of those migrant workers that come to Russia to make money to send home to their families in Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan or wherever, these workers, many of whom have been naturalized Russian citizens, they're going to lose that Russian citizenship if they don't show up at these conscription centers. 4.5 million Uzbek citizens live inside of Russia. 1 million Kyrgyzstan citizens live inside of Russia. I don't have the actual figure for Tajiks, but somewhere in that range as well. Now, here's what the Russians are doing. they are opening recruitment center inside of Moscow's Sakharova Migration Center. So you have a center in Moscow where the migrants are taken, for health screenings and documentation, and all of the I guess you could say sort of routine processing that migrants who arrive in a new country go through. They now have set up a military recruiting center inside of that same facility. So you can already see what's happening here. It's not like it's there just for convenience. It's there to force these migrants through the military. You want to be in Russia, you want to make money in Russia and send it home to your family. Guess what? You're going to do a year in Ukraine. So that's where this is now headed. Now, and now the Russian government actually has put out the decree for compulsory military service 1 year for any Russian citizen who has been naturalized coming from Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan. Minimum of 1 year. Now, this needs to be weighed against the other news coming out of Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan. That being that Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan, the governments both came out explicitly warning their citizens not to fight on behalf of Russia in Ukraine, reminding them that it is against their own domestic, their own country's laws to fight for a foreign government. So here you have the migrant workers from Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan and elsewhere who are now basically pitted in the middle between the government of their home country and the government of their adopted country. And how are they going to choose? What are they going to do? Is this going to cause those workers to flee back to their home countries? Can they even flee at this point? It's not entirely clear. So you have these Central Asian republics that Russia sees as part of their sphere of influence, the former Soviet space, the space that Putin and his people see as naturally theirs. These countries are pulling away from Russia. And remember, and I've talked about Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan recently in another video, remember, these countries have attempted to some degree, dissociate themselves from Russia and China in various ways as they look more towards Turkey. Again, these are, well, with the exception of the Tajiks, these are Turkic-speaking peoples of Central Asia with a cultural affinity towards Turkey. Kazakhstan, for example, as I've mentioned many times, had a workers' uprising earlier this year in January that was put down by the Russian military at the behest of Kazakhstan's government. And Kazakhstan's government, which was saved by Russia's government, now doesn't want anything to do with Russia's government. And that was only 7-8 months ago. Okay, so the conflict that has emerged between Russia on the one hand and Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan on the other hand, I think again reminds us of just how badly Putin blundered in this war. He has now created strained relations with countries that theoretically he should have dominion over, at least to some degree. Now, not that that would be appropriate or correct, but that from the perspective of great power politics, one would expect the Russians, who have used their military in these places recently, to have a little bit more influence over what these governments are doing, but they do not. And to that point, and this is the last thing I'm going to cover because I'm about to hit 40 minutes here, to that point, another story. This one, this came from, I think this was the Moscow Times. I got to find it. I'm not positive. The headline: Uzbekistan suspends Russia's mir payment system. Very, very interesting. Oh, here it is. It was Moscow Times. Uzbekistan suspends Russia's mir payment system. This was today, September 23rd. Uzbekistan is now moving forward with eliminating this credit payment system that the Russians developed in response to the sanctions in 2015 after they annexed Crimea. So this system, which, by the way, the Russians have not been able successfully to really put forward as a global payment system, now it's not even going to work in Uzbekistan. And now the reason for this is really interesting, and this again tells us a lot about the situation. The reason for this is because Uzbekistan has now gotten pressure from the United States to drop the mir payment system, and Uzbekistan is agreeing to do so. So again, we can see just how Putin's blunder in Ukraine has really forced even countries on his own border to side with the United States in various ways. Turkey is now also feeling pressure from the United States to do the same. If Turkey is to do that, that's going to really impact what how Russians feel. Turkey is a major destination for Russians, Russians of means, Russians with the money and the wherewithal to be able to leave the country. Oftentimes they choose to go to Turkey because of proximity and exchange rates and general well, all the reasons of convenience that people do these things. So the U.S. is now threatening Turkish banks who are continuing to accept settlements through the mere payment system, right? So again, we see how Russia supposedly building out its own self-sufficiency, it's falling on its face. And even Nabulina, who is the head of Russia's central bank, almost seen as probably the most respected figure in Russia, at least among Western folks who see her as eminently reasonable compared to some of the others. Nabulina herself has admitted that Russia has faced severe problems in rolling out this payment system as a means of sort of countering U.S. sanctions. And I think the symbolic message is probably the biggest one of all here, that even those countries that Russia would like to see as part of the CSTO, the Collective Security Treaty Organization, Russia's answer to NATO, as part of Russia's military sphere, as part of Russia's geopolitical sphere of influence, all of that, these countries are dissociating from Putin. That is extremely worrying for the Kremlin, and who knows how that's going to play out, but that's something to follow. Okay, I went twice as long as I said I would. Go over to Patreon, patreon.com/Eric Draitser. So much more there. Check out the videos, some of which are available for free, some of which you got to be a subscriber for. Subscribe to Counterpunch. Thanks as always. I'll talk to you again next